Okay, well, hello and welcome to the UCCS Speaker Series. I'm Richard Kravitz, Director of UCCS. And with this lecture today, we're finishing up our 2019-20 focus on three major themes: housing and homelessness, the use of big data to inform policy, and most pertinent to today, climate change adaptation. Even as we have started to sneak in talks related to our 2020-2021 themes, which include economic recovery after the COVID pandemic, California's changing workforce, and a series on publicly funded education. So please do check our website, uccs.ucdavis.edu, for more information about upcoming talks, including a very important panel next week on July 8th about safe reopening during the COVID pandemic. So now to today's lecture. We're very pleased to have with us Professor Michael Loik. He's a professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Toronto and a PhD from UCLA. After his graduate work, he spent some time as an assistant professor at Cal State San Bernardino, our sister system, before moving to UC Santa Cruz, where he's published many scientific articles and teaches, among other things, a large survey course on climate change. His research is focused on how changes in rainfall affect plant and ecosystem processes in dry regions, including 4 US deserts, the Eastern Sierra Nevada, and Australia. This work is directly connected to our theme of climate change adaptation, how to make the best of a warming world, which is, of course, as I said, one of our foci. Professor Loik has also worked on a number of very interesting cutting-edge technologies designed to capture carbon and produce clean energy. And we're just delighted to have him here with us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Loik. Dr. Loik.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz, and thanks to everyone for joining us today from wherever you are located. I'm going to jump right in and begin by noting the amazing diversity of California, and I'll start with these images, these iconic images of California that bring to mind all the various amazing aspects of the state, the things that we think about when we think about California, and the diversity of people and ideas and innovation, and also physical and biological diversity. Our state is very diverse in terms of topography and weather and climate and soils, and this leads to the observation that California is a hotspot, a global hotspot of biodiversity because of this range of conditions and resources available to organisms here. So by way of a brief roadmap from the lakes basin of Mammoth Lakes in the background, I'll start, wrong direction. I will start off by describing very briefly California's precipitation patterns and how they relate to drought in California. I will then briefly describe a little bit about our historic drought from 2012 to 2016. I will talk very broadly about some drought impacts in California, and then show a few examples of how drought impacts ecological patterns and processes drawn from my research team's work. And then with 3 different examples. And then I'll have a few closing thoughts towards the end. So I'm just going to keep moving right along here and start off by talking about California's precipitation patterns. And to do that, I'll set the stage by introducing, well, the precipitation patterns of the entire lower 48. And various things are highly notable in this map. And first of all, I should point out the color legend down here is that the colors that are reds and dark reds are drier places, and the greens and blues are wetter places. And what I think probably stands out to most people is how green and regular the pattern is in the eastern half of the country and how splotchy and red it is in the western half of the country. We see some very high precipitation averages, and this is based on data from 1961 to 1990. And we see high precipitation along the coast of Northern California, Oregon, Washington. We see the impact of the Sierra Nevada, and a lot of this splotchiness in the west has to do in part with those coastal mountains, as well as the Rocky Mountains, as well as some large scale circulation patterns in the way that air moves around the surface of the planet. If we zoom in on California, we see features that we're all familiar with. Again, the Sierra Nevada showing up here. We see the warm, dry deserts of the southeastern part of the state. We see the bathtub shape of the Central Valley. And in fact, I like to point out the difference between Yuma and Eureka. And in fact, based on the average temperatures, again, from 61 to 90, the average across the state line from Yuma is about 4% of the average in Eureka. And so we have the broad range, huge range of precipitation patterns across the state. We have a lot of topography, different kinds of soils, and all of this combines to create numerous ecological opportunities for organisms to occupy, take advantage of, and that's what leads to our tremendous biodiversity. Now, our patterns that account for this kind, the processes that account for the kinds of patterns we see in this colored image here are driven by different ways that precipitation ends up in California. So one way that this happens is that some of our wintertime precipitation events, we have a Mediterranean climate, means it's cool and wet in the winter and warm and dry, very dry in the summer. But in the winter, we have these cold winter systems from the Gulf of Alaska that are good for delivering snowpack to the Sierra Nevada and other mountain systems. Sometimes, depending on the way that things shape up out over the Pacific with rainfall events or with storm systems, they might tap into a source of warmer water out over the tropical Pacific. And these are systems we refer to as atmospheric rivers, or ARs, from tropical water. Sometimes these are called the Pineapple Express by meteorologists on TV. And these storms tend to be warmer and sometimes wetter and can be very intense and act almost like a fire hose to bring precipitation to the state. In some parts of the state, we have other factors that are temporal or spatial in nature, such as the summer monsoon from the Gulf of California in the summertime that leads to thunderstorms out over the deserts and the Sierra. And then along the coast, of course, we have summer coastal fog and stratus or low-lying clouds in the summertime, June gloom, sometimes called. And that can be very important for the ecosystems along the coast, particularly things like our coast redwoods that rely on that summertime coastal fog as a source of moisture when there is no rain, true rain falling. Okay, so this is a talk about drought. So let's dive into how we try to understand drought in California. And these data are from the US Drought Monitor. And if you look that up, if you're interested in these kinds of maps for California and the rest of the country, you type in US Drought Monitor in your favorite search engine and you will go to our drought.gov and you can access data like these. So we're looking at a map of the state of California with its counties outlined. And we see these different colors of yellow, brown, red, indicating the severity of drought. We can go into the definitions later on, but we can see an interesting pattern here from last week's data. This should renew either today or tomorrow, in which we see that the southern part of the state, portrayed in white, is actually not experiencing much drought at all. And the most extreme drought up at around the Shasta Trinity area of far northern California. And so you could go on this website and you can get data that tell us about the state of drought for California, or any state for that matter, the country as a whole, and comparing that to conditions a week ago or a year ago or so on. So I'll be using these maps a bit throughout today's talk. Now, another way to look at the degree of drought in California is by looking at this time course. Now, let me orient you to this graph. On the y-axis, we have percent from 0 to 100%, and that's the percent area of California that is in some form of drought. And drought, again, is expressed in this scale along the bottom, from yellow, meaning the least amount of drought, to the dark red, D4, the most drought. And looking across the horizontal x-axis, we see that these are data from the year 2000 until this year. And what I'd like to point out is that if you just look along the horizontal line, there's almost no time when the conditions are white, which is absolutely no drought on the map. There's almost always some mix of yellow, orange, and red, or even dark red. And this is our historic drought from 2012 to the 2016-2017 period, depending on how you define that. So one of the in a nutshell results of today's talk is that California, or some part of California, is almost always in drought. And so we know this from recent history, from the historic drought starting in 2012, and we saw scenes like this in many of the reservoirs in the state. And then this was followed in 2017 by a very wet year with a number of deluge storms that are very disruptive in and of themselves to lives and livelihoods, property, and the state's economy. So our weather tends to swing from drought to deluge and back again. And in fact, in many parts of the state, if you ask what a normal precipitation year is, there almost isn't one, because conditions go from wet to dry quite rapidly. So let's talk about the historic drought in 2016. And this was driven in part by a coupled ocean atmospheric phenomenon that many have heard referred to as the giant blob, a patch of warm water out over the Pacific Ocean, kind of to the west of British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, that seemed to have an influence, and it's not quite clear if the atmosphere was driving the surface temperatures or the other way around, but there was a high pressure system associated with that blob of warm water, and the storm tracks tended to go to the north, up and around that high pressure system. They were kind of steered by that rotation and away from California. And here is a false color image of one of those rainfall systems. This is in 2014 with the jet stream traveling way to the north, up and around California and much of the West Coast. In fact, this is also the same year when Boston was deluged with tremendous amounts of snow. Okay, now if we go back to those drought monitor maps, this is what that period looks like. Here is June 2011, which was our last winter of 2010. 2011 was the last wet year before the drought. So the map is completely clear. And then in 2012, we had, well, I'll show some rainfall precipitation data in a bit, but you can see the impact of the encroaching drought throughout the state and how it becomes darker, redder color through June 2016, in which rain and snowfall was starting to recover at that period of time. And then June 2017 was the first of a couple of rather wet years. 2018, not as wet. 2019 was wet again. And then we've just gone through a rather unusual 2020 as well, with a late start to the rainfall season and then a pronounced dry season here in Northern California. Now, some clever scientists linked the tree ring records of various trees in California with that drought period. And many of you are probably familiar with the fact that you can use the thickness of annual ring growth to help inform our knowledge about past climates. You can look at how much a tree grows in a certain year with a certain amount of rainfall or snowfall, and the temperatures for that year. And then you can calibrate the amount of growth with the rain and snowfall and temperature conditions, and then use that to go backwards, going into rings in towards the center of the tree to reconstruct climate. And doing this, we can look at various kinds of climate reconstructions, and Griffin and Anchiitis actually showed that drought, and particularly the year 2015, which was quite dry in terms of the Sierra Nevada snowpack, was indicative of a 1 in 1,200 year drought. So that dry period, 2012 to 2015, 2016, was the likes of which we hadn't seen for several centuries. Of course, the people who were here at the time certainly experienced it then. And so that's the citation there if you want to go back and read that fascinating paper on how they were able to figure that out. Okay, so what are some of the kinds of impacts that we saw from that? Well, we're all familiar with many of them. There was several, many examples over the years in the news. We'll start off, of course, with our agricultural sector. And when there's very little snowpack, then there's not as much water storage in our reservoirs, and the water that's available to be transmitted throughout our highly engineered system for delivering water in the state was put under stress. And we saw a variety of outcomes in terms of the crops that are grown. You can see here in these images over on the left-hand side, almonds, walnuts, pistachios, broccoli, strawberries, grapes, tomatoes, and lettuce, all anywhere from 3/4 to over 90% of the country's production here in California, largely in the Central Valley, but in other places as well, such as the Salinas Valley and Imperial County growing regions. And so these regions were heavily impacted in terms of loss of crop revenue, livestock, and dairy revenues. And then when there's not as much water that's flowing down, melting out of the snowpack, being stored in reservoirs, then growers were required to basically have to rely on pumping groundwater, which costs money, and it overdraws groundwater aquifers, leads to salination and other issues. And of course, if you're using fossil fuels to pump that water, it's contributing to global warming. Our water supply impacts went, of course, beyond the effects on the agricultural sector. Here we see some of the other costs associated with that drought, so that the surface water reduction was met in part, but not entirely, by groundwater pumping. I think this is just for 2015 or 14, not sure, almost $2 billion in agricultural costs, and more than that in terms of the statewide general costs. Okay, another important impact, of course, is on the trees and vegetation of the state. And this is on a background of a global pattern, a large-scale loss of forest cover that is being attributed to climate change, but also to invasive species and insect pest outbreaks, some of which are also invasive species, and numerous connections and interconnections between some of these factors. So there's a global large-scale loss of forests around the world, but we're also seeing that here in California, and that was accelerated by our drought. In 2015, the California Department of Forestry claimed that there were 66 million dead trees in California. I took a bit of a trip around the state, and I thought to myself, you know what, I think it's more like about 100 million dead trees. And the revision the next year was 107 million dead trees, so I wasn't that far off. And then that was revised again in 2017 to almost 130 million dead trees. And there are many discussions going on. Perhaps some of you listening in today are part of those discussions about how we deal with those trees and what the best plan is for this situation. But numerous factors, warming and drying of our weather patterns, and past patterns of land use and forest management, and now drying and insects and climate change, and all of these things together leading to enhanced wildland fire risk, both in terms of the numbers of fires, but also in terms of the area burned increasing tremendously over the years. And we know that there have been many tragic examples in recent years in the North Bay and up near Chico and Paradise, and many of the communities in Southern California, Santa Barbara, and around the Southern California area have, very few regions have escaped this effect. Okay, so I want to turn next to some more specific impacts and maybe a couple of somewhat surprising results. Perhaps I should leave that up to you to judge that, but nevertheless, here are some images of the Sierra Nevada snowpack taken from satellites, and there's just a tremendous amount of these kinds of data available online for understanding these kinds of patterns and processes. And here I'm showing 8 years of Sierra Nevada snow depth, starting again in 2011, which was that last wet year before our historic drought, historic 1 in 1,200 year drought. And here's the scale for snow depth in this case. So lighter colors indicate 0 on up towards the deeper purple or magenta color. 2011, we can see an extensive and deep snowpack. And then we see the onset of the drought. 2013, the snowpack is a little bit meager, but really 2015 is the one I wanted to point out, where the snowpack was at its lowest in the Sierra. And I should point out this is taken on the 1st of April, which is a benchmark date that the California Department of Water Resources uses to help model, project the amount of water available for California's use for the rest of that year. And then we see again a partial recovery of the snowpack in 2016, and then a substantial snowpack again in 2017. So my research team has been working near Mammoth Lakes, California for over 20 years now. And there are numerous reasons for this. In part, we know that the statewide water project has highly engineered the meltwater from the Sierra, both the western slope and the eastern slope, here are the Twin Lakes near Mammoth Lakes, to capture that water and to carry it across several hundred miles to the city of LA. So the Owens River and the area I'm going to talk about for the next few slides about snow climate change is really in the headwaters of the Los Angeles watershed. The snow that melts ends up in the Owens River, which then ends up itself in the LA aqueduct across the Mojave Desert, and then transmitted to the reservoirs in LA. And here is what I think is a fascinating record that dates back to the days of William Mulholland and when they were first starting to scout out the water of the Sierra Nevada snowpack on the east side there. And let me just walk through what we're looking at here. These are long-term data for the 1st of April snow depth. And the California Department of Water Resources deploys people across the state to measure the snow depth in various places. And in Mammoth Lakes is one of those places, Mammoth Pass. And here's annual snow depth on April 1st, going all the way back to 1928. So it's like 90+ year data set now. And you can see from the records that there are many ups and downs and peaks and valleys in this record. And I've gone ahead and drawn in the average, which is that black line, the solid black line in the center. 1 and 2 standard deviations, which tells us about the variability of the data, are plotted as these dashed blue and sort of reddish colored lines here. And then 2 standard deviations, which are real outliers, is portrayed with this upper dashed darker blue line, and 2 standard deviations is kind of hidden by the x-axis here. So we're looking from the early 1930s all the way up to, well, April 1st, just a couple months ago. And so we see a lot of variability in these data. So that's a very highly variable snowpack regime. And note here also that 2015, where I've got my cursor pointed at the moment, is the only year in this entire data set for which there is 0 inches or centimeters, as you prefer, of snow on the ground on April 1st. And so that's a real outlier. There are I think there are 14 other years in which the snow depth was more than 1 standard deviation below the average, but 2015 really takes the cake in that regard. If we take all of these years and we combine them and we categorize them into a probability distribution, then we see that all of those years that include the drought are all in the lowest of the low years that we might even expect in this region based on these data. On the other hand, those wet years of 2011 and 2017 reside up here. I should have pointed out that this vertical line is the median or the middle value. And then these vertical dash lines are 1 and 2, are 1 standard deviation above and below that median. And so that provides us with sort of an idea of how broadly dispersed these events are. And we see those wet years are quite a bit different than the dry years. Just a way of kind of comparing between these years. So our team has been asking questions about how does variation in precipitation affect vegetation, plants, and the ecosystems in which they reside. I should also include here the communities, the plant communities, the members of the vegetation community. And so we have been doing this utilizing manipulations of snow depth that have been going on for about 60 years. I'll tell you about that in a moment, how we've managed that. We have been doing these measurements for about 20 years ourselves, going out there in Mammoth Lakes. You can see we're looking in this photo, we're looking west, just to the north of the ski area itself. And then some of our experiments involve a gradient analysis, taking advantage of several hundred meters of elevation difference that we're able to access in this region. And noting also the vegetation in this photo, it's actually part of the Great Basin Desert. Once you get the other side of the Sierra Nevada, it's a high elevation cold desert that you kind of drive through. If you're driving from, say, Tahoe to Denver or Salt Lake City, that's the Great Basin, and that's kind of the vegetation you see in the valleys at the lower elevations out there. Okay. So a good place to study snow and its contribution to what can flow downstream and drought is a research station near Mammoth Lakes, California. And this is my plug for the UC Natural Reserve System. It's one of the crown jewels of the UC system, which is our field stations, roughly 30 of them around the state in all kinds of different habitats. And this one, of course, in Sierra Nevada habitat, there's actually 2 facilities there. And there's a little bit of background about the site in terms of, I should point out that much of the water in this region falls in the form of snow between October and April. The melt date depends on how much snow there is. A heavy snow year melts later. A lower snow year melts earlier. And so that in itself, although I won't talk much about it today, is a really big driver of how and what plants and animals, for that matter, do in light of climate change. So how do we manipulate snow? Well, we have utilized snow fences that Caltrans built in the 1950s, and they have been placed along US Highway 395 to keep blowing snow from going across 395. And for every dollar that is spent on building and maintaining a snow fence, and you can see that's that wooden structure in this image, you save about $10 on having a person in a plow driving back and forth on Highway 395 and keeping it free of wind-blown snow. Various kinds of agencies use snow fences to manipulate snow for water or traffic control, as the case may be. These ones here are about 4 meters tall and over, well, anywhere from 80 to well over 100 meters long, and they are set back from the highway. And the way that they work is portrayed in this cartoon, courtesy of one of my former graduate students, Catherine Wade. So this green thing is our cartoon fence, and notice the distances that are portrayed here at the bottom. So what happens is that in the wintertime, the wind blows either during a snowstorm or afterwards, and often it is blowing snow in what we call a laminar manner, that is in layers along the ground. The snow blows along the ground and it encounters the snow fence, and that causes the wind to slow down to dependent on the height and the amount of space in the fence, and creates what's called an equilibrium snowdrift. The wind slows down, the flakes fall out, and they build up here. And then instead of blowing across the highway, they build up here just downwind of the fence. And so we have created research plots, either 50 meters upwind of the snow fence. We call that the ambient snow depth, whatever happens to be the snow depth for that year. And we usually go out and measure this in February. We have the increased snow depth, 13 meters downwind of the fence, and that's again based on the height and the amount of space in the fence. That's where the maximal depth is. We call those the increased snow depth plots or plus snow plots. And then further downwind, because you have this accumulation, you have less snow here. We call those the decreased snow depth plots. So this has been going on for, like I said, about 60 years. So Caltrans built us this experiment for free 60 years ago, back before I was even born, in fact. And so we come along starting around 2002, 2003 and start trying to understand how this long-term pattern of increased snow and decreased snow, slightly decreased snow, affects the things that go on in this ecosystem. This is a photo of what it looks like in a deep snow year. I believe this is 2005, one of my former students taking a snow depth measurement. This is the increased snow depth plot here. Looking west towards the ski area, in fact, in the background. These are our two main players of some of the work we do. You can see the cone-bearing evergreen trees in the background. We do some work with those, especially the work along the elevation gradient. I won't talk about as much about them today. But these two shrub species, well, the one here on the right, Great Basin sagebrush, is arguably one of the most widespread shrub species in the US, in the lower 48 anyways. Very common, and it's the one that you see if you're driving from, say, Tahoe to Salt Lake City, an endless sea of these shrubs. The other species is also very widespread, and it's notable because it does this biochemical thing with a partner in the soil that allows it to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turn it into biochemically useful forms. This is called a process called nitrogen fixation. Not all species do it, but some do it, and this is one that does it, and so that makes it an interesting member of the plant community to better understand. So we focus a lot of our work on these two species. They're also both deeply rooted, and that allows them to access water at times of the year when other species with shallower roots would not be able to do so. You notice in the foreground, all of this rocky soil. There's not a lot of grass or other stuff kind of filling in the space between these shrubs. So they're pretty well set up, I think, to survive in this kind of a system. Okay, here's your brief reminder about photosynthesis. Plants take up water, which goes through the plant and out to the atmosphere, but some of it is used in photosynthesis. They take up carbon dioxide through little tiny holes in their leaves, and it's all powered by sunlight. And they make sugars that will fill up the tomatoes or keep the roots below ground alive. Oxygen is a byproduct that we can make use of. And so understanding photosynthesis helps us to provide us with a sort of a mechanistic understanding of what's happening in the way that plants grow or the way that they respond to things like drought or freezing or a whole host of different kinds of things in their environment, which are not just physical things, it can also be responses to fungal infection or insect outbreaks and so on. All right, so now here is one of just a handful of graphs. Now there's some official units here. If you're interested, you can see them later. I just covered it up. This is shrub photosynthesis for those two species, the widespread one on the top, the one that does nitrogen fixation on the bottom. And there are three lines that correspond to those plots where there's more snow. There's the average of the year snow, or there's a slight reduction, about a 25%, 1/4 reduction in the snow depth compared to the ambient. And then finally, we're looking at this from the beginning of the drought through to 2016. So in 2011, that was that last wet year before the drought. We have these rates of photosynthesis, which are hardly representative for these species. And then the drought ensues. 2012 is drier. And we see that the photosynthetic rates go way down. So we make these measurements the same time every year. And we see that after 2012, if you kind of squint your eyes, maybe there's a bit of a recovery over the ensuing years. Likewise, for this species, maybe not. There's certainly a dip in 2014 for both. But we've been making these measurements for a while, and actually if you look at what the average was for the previous 10 years, that's portrayed by this dashed line. So by about 2015, 2016, the plants are pretty close to that 10-year average before the drought. So they've actually recovered in terms of photosynthesis by about 2015. And that's the same case here for the other species that does the nitrogen fixation. So in fact, the plants were back to normal, if you will, in terms of their hydration and photosynthesis by 2015, even though our reservoirs had not filled up again. We'll get back to that notion in a moment. Now, if we actually look at growth, how much new leaves they put on, what that previous graph showed us was how much carbon dioxide goes into the leaves, and we measure that using a fancy device that we clamp onto the leaf. We can walk around to different plants and make that measurement. This measurement is growth, and we actually cut off parts of the plant and weigh the material, the new material that grew that year. And we can see, again, this is the two different species, and I've just boiled it down to the overall patterns because there's not much difference between those snow depth plots. The snow depth affects other things that I don't have time to get into now, and I need to keep moving here. But we see a dramatic drop in growth, and then again, that approach back to the normal levels of growth by about 2015 or 2016. So recovery from record drought started to occur even before the big wet year of 2017. I'm not going to go through all of these details, but by doing 20 years of measurements, we capture a lot of really kind of cool things at this site, including 2015, which I pointed out earlier. There was no snow on April 1st, but there was rain that year, and almost the same amount of water was delivered in the form of rain instead of snow. And in fact, the plants were able to make use of that. So it seems like, well, is it rain, is it snow? At least for these shrubs, they didn't seem to really care. This is at one of our high elevation sites. This is what winter looked like in 2016 when things were starting to show signs of that recovery. But then we wondered, well, what's 2017 going to bring? And in fact, in 2017, winter really returned. And if we look at the precipitation patterns at our sites, these are cumulative graphs starting in October, which is when the hydrologic year begins, and going through to the following September. And so the rain precipitation builds up, and then it resets to 0 on October 1st. And so here you can see how the patterns built up in 2011. And 2012, 13, 14, 15. 15 was that year with no snow. This is all rain, mostly rain. And then again, another wet year in 2016. But in 2017, the precipitation dwarfed the patterns that we see here in, I'll just put all those maps back on. And then I'll point out this photo down here taken of the parking lot of the main lodge at Mammoth Mountain Ski Area. And you can see how deep that snowdrift was that year. In fact, there was some satellite observations of 90-foot drifts in the backcountry of the Sierra in winter 2017. And by winter 2017, in fact, the plant growth had recovered right back to where it was prior to the drought. So here's the growth in 2011, and here's the growth during the drought. And then in 2017, it had pretty much bounced right back and so plant recovery, the growth recovered after the drought. For the other species, the nitrogen fixer, the responses was similar, but the patterns were not the same. And this is something we see time and again with climate change and vegetation, is that every species has a different story. Now, we also do some drought research here out in Western California, and we're part of something called the International Drought Experiment. And this is an experiment going on in over 100 sites around the world, building those rainout shelters you saw in the last photo. We'll see them again in a moment. To better understand the impacts of drought on biodiversity and plant growth, ecosystem productivity. We built our site in 2015. We were one of the flagship sites. You can see how dry it is in the background, still the consequences are a drought. So we built a drought experiment during a drought, and more than a few people I think were chuckling at me about that one. This site is a heavily invaded California coastal prairie. It's previously agricultural land. We do a lot of experiments on ecosystem restoration here, but you can see almost everything in this photo is not native to California or the Santa Cruz area. And again, you can see a photo of these shelters, and they are designed, they've got these little plastic V-shaped troughs on this metal frame, and they are spaced far apart to let 40% of the rain in and to intercept 60%. And that is designed to recreate a 1 in 100 year drought for the vegetation underneath. There are also barriers that we buried in the ground around these plots to prevent lateral movement of water and roots. We measure biodiversity and plant growth, and I use this as a wonderful teaching laboratory. These are all some of our UC Santa Cruz students lending a hand, measuring photosynthesis. And one set of results from this experiment here is, again, pretty much that same period of time, 2015 to 2019, with the end of the drought and the rainfall shown here with these vertical aqua bars. 2017 was a very wet year. Plant growth on the control or open plots is plotted with these blue lines, and the growth on the drought plots is shown in the red lines. And what may stand out is that every year is different, for one thing. And then during the drought, notice that the plant growth went down. During the really wet year, the plant growth went down, suggesting this is a very wet site, and that excess rainfall, in fact, probably, or we hypothesize, changes the soil chemistry enough to actually hinder the growth. And if you've noticed here, plant growth was actually higher under the drought shelters in that extremely wet year. So that was a bit of a surprise for us. So climate change ecology is often full of these surprises. So the effect of drought on growth really depends on the year, whether it's the amount of snow or the amount of rain that you get. And then finally, closing up here, one other management type note was to ask questions. We're asking questions in terms of adaptation, is how can we adapt land management, restoration, and other kinds of measures to account for climate change. And so we're interested in French broom and the amount of water that it utilizes. And we know that French broom poses a fire risk in many chaparral communities throughout the state. What does removal of French broom mean for water in the soil? And we installed a bunch of these soil moisture probes. And this was actually done, I was a mentor for a high school science team in the San Lorenzo Valley here near Santa Cruz. And they actually won several science fair awards for this project, where they installed these sensors in where there was no French broom, or where French broom had invaded, or where French broom had been actively pulled. And they found that, in fact, when you pull French broom, that you leave more water in the soil. There's less roots, there's below ground, less leaves above ground, that's allowing the soil water to escape. And so we're now comparing this in wet and dry years and looking at some other measures of plant water use by these weedy species. Okay, and now for a few closing thoughts. I'm running out of time. First of all, when it comes to drought and deluge, an important linkage emerges between vegetation growth in the wet years over on the left-hand side of this diagram, which are followed by dry years. And what we said is that there's almost always some part of California that's experiencing drought, and that leads to dry, dead fire fuel. And again, this is a perfect setup for feeding into the wildland fire cycle. And so I think that that's an important place where we can manage our wildland fire risk, is through understanding drought and what it means for plant growth and plant dying, and for our land management practices. Okay, so as I said, California is almost always in some degree of drought. And different parts of the state can experience different degrees of drought. You remember that first map, Northern California is in drought. Paradoxically, Southern California is not right now. Vegetation may not always respond to drought in preconceived ways. And that's a major thing, in my opinion. And when it comes to drought policy, I am wondering if we should be thinking about drought policy hand in hand with wildland fire policy, at least at certain levels. And so I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna say thank you for listening, and I hope that there's some time for some questions. Dr. Kravitz?